Racist cop attacked a black man who was deaf and had cerebral palsy. 2 officers were fired. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. The air was supposed to be calm that afternoon, a quiet street, the kind of suburb where even the wind felt polite. But calm has a way of breaking when power forgets mercy. It began with flashing lights slicing through the silence and a voice shouting, "Hands where I can see them," words that carried more fear than law. A black man stood beside his silver van, one hand gripping a grocery bag, the other trembling in midair, not from guilt, but from effort. His name was Elijah Brooks, 42 years old, deaf since birth, living with cerebral palsy. He didn't hear the command, but he felt its weight in the vibration of the asphalt. The officer, white, broad-shouldered, uniform pressed to perfection, mistook hesitation for defiance. And that mistake was about to become a story the entire city would remember. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Elijah. The officer's name was Carter Mills, 36, known in the department for his firm hand. He'd stopped Elijah because the van had rolled too close to a stop sign. Routine, he said, but his tone carried something heavier, something that made the air thicken. "Do you understand me?" he barked. Elijah didn't respond. He was reading lips, slow, careful, trying to process the words. His muscles twitched the way they always did when his nerves tightened. To Carter, it looked like resistance. "Don't move!" Carter shouted again, louder this time, hand resting on his holster. The second officer, Dana Holt, mid-42nds, arrived moments later, calmer, unsure, glancing between them. "He's not responding," Carter snapped. "He's ignoring me." Dana looked closer, eyes narrowing. "He's wearing a medical bracelet," she said quietly. But Carter didn't hear her, or didn't want to. The tension thickened. Elijah lifted his hands again, slow, uneven. He was signing, trying to spell his name in American Sign Language. Carter saw the motion and lunged. The grocery bag fell, oranges rolling across the pavement like small suns. A child across the street froze on his bike. The sound that followed wasn't a gunshot, it was the dull, sick echo of impact. Elijah's body hit the hood of the van. "Stop resisting!" Carter yelled. But there was no resistance, only confusion, pain, the kind of silence that screams louder than words. Dana stepped back, eyes wide. "Carter, stop, he's disabled." But the world had already recorded. From a porch, a phone camera blinked red. A neighbor's voice whispered, "He can't even hear you." And somewhere beneath that chaos, Elijah tried to mouth the words that no one heard. "I'm not a threat." The siren wailed late, as if realizing too slow what it had been summoned to witness. By the time backup arrived, the calm street had become a stage, one man bleeding, another shouting orders to ghosts, and a city about to wake up to its own reflection. By the time the first siren faded, the street had filled with neighbors clutching their phones. The silver van still idled, a soft hum against the rising noise. Elijah Brooks lay against the hood, motionless except for the faint tremor of his hands. Officer Carter Mills stood over him, breathing hard, as if restraint took effort. Officer Dana Holt, pale now, had already called for paramedics. "He cannot hear you," she repeated, voice shaking. "He is deaf." But Carter's reply came sharp, defensive. "He was moving fast. I thought he was reaching." The words were habit, not truth. On the other side of the tape, a teenager named Marcus Reed kept filming. He was 16, the kind of kid who always said he wanted to be a journalist. His voice on the video cracked with disbelief. "He is disabled, man. Look at his wristband." The bracelet gleamed under the afternoon sun, engraved with 2 words, "Deaf, cerebral palsy." Dana leaned over, her gloves trembling. "Elijah, can you hear me?" she asked out of instinct, then caught herself and signed, slowly, "I am sorry. Help is coming." Elijah blinked once, barely conscious, his eyes searching for safety in a language the chaos did not speak. Carter stepped back, realizing too late what the badge on Elijah's chest pocket meant. It was laminated, worn at the edges. It read, "Assisted living employee, caregiver." The crowd's murmur thickened into anger. "You hit a caregiver," someone shouted. Another voice joined. "He did not do anything." Dana looked around, panic blooming behind her composure. "Carter, we need to step away." "I followed procedure," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. A woman from the porch, Mrs. Lane, a retired nurse, pushed past the barrier shouting, "You call that procedure?" A deputy held her back, but not before her words cut through the siren noise. "You could have killed him because you cannot listen." The irony hung heavy. At the same time, the video Marcus filmed hit social media. Within 15 minutes, number Justice for Elijah began trending across the state. By the time Internal Affairs arrived, reporters were already circling the block. A young black sergeant, Naomi Clark, stepped out of an unmarked SUV, her eyes cold but calm. "Secure the scene," she said. Her presence shifted the energy immediately. She knelt beside Elijah, signaling the paramedics to wait a moment. Her hands moved in sign language. "You are safe." He blinked again, one slow tear cutting through the dust on his cheek. Then Naomi stood, facing Carter. "What happened here?" she asked. Carter's jaw tightened. "He refused orders. I believed he was dangerous." Naomi pointed to Elijah's ID. "That man could not even hear you. You struck a disabled citizen under false assumption." Dana stepped forward, her voice low but firm. "He told me to grab him." He hesitated. "I should have stopped him." The cameras caught every word. Carter turned red, but silence was louder than any excuse. The sergeant glanced toward the onlookers, then back to her officers. "You are both relieved of duty pending investigation," she said clearly. A collective gasp rolled through the crowd. It was not vengeance, it was accountability. As Elijah was lifted onto a stretcher, his hand brushed Naomi's arm. He mouthed two slow words, "Thank you." She nodded once, then turned toward the cameras, her voice steady enough to cut through the storm. "This department serves the people, not our own fear. What happened here will not be buried." And as the ambulance door closed, the light from its siren reflected off the badge on her chest, not as authority, but as promise. By the time the sun began to fall behind the rooftops, the video had already reached 500,000 views. Local news vans parked along the curb, lights glaring against the darkening sky. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispering and pointing toward the same silver van that had become a symbol of everything wrong and overdue. Inside the small ambulance, Elijah Brooks lay still, an oxygen mask covering his face. The paramedic adjusted the straps gently, whispering directions to the driver. At the hospital, cameras flashed as the stretcher rolled through the glass doors. Sergeant Naomi Clark followed behind, her uniform immaculate but her expression carved from exhaustion. She had seen injustice before, but not like this, not filmed, not this visible. She met the attending physician, Dr. Raymond Kim, who spoke quickly. "Bruised ribs, concussion, but he will recover." Naomi nodded. "We need to document everything," she said. "Chain of evidence, all medical notes, time-stamped." Dr. Kim hesitated, glancing toward the waiting room filled with reporters. "It is already public," he said quietly. "The footage speaks louder than any report." Across town, Carter Mills sat alone in an interrogation room, his badge on the table in front of him. The room was gray, silent except for the low hum of the air vent. A clock ticked somewhere behind him. Internal Affairs agents entered without greeting. One of them, a woman named Ellen Duarte, placed a tablet on the table and pressed play. The screen replayed his own voice, angry, commanding, followed by the sickening sound of impact. Carter stared at it like it was someone else. "You understand this is not just a suspension," Ellen said. "This is excessive force against a disabled civilian." His throat tightened. You thought wrong," she interrupted. Outside, Dana Holt waited with her lawyer. Her hands shook as she filled out the statement form. She replayed the moment again and again, the bracelet, the eyes, the voice inside her head telling her to speak up sooner. Guilt pressed harder than any reprimand. Meanwhile, Naomi sat in her cruiser outside the hospital, scrolling through live comments under the hashtag. Some were angry, some were hateful, but one pinned post stopped her scrolling. It was from a woman named Lydia Brooks, tagged as Elijah's sister. The caption read, "He cannot speak for himself, so I will. We demand accountability." This was not a mistake. It was a pattern. Naomi exhaled slowly. She had read those words before, in other cases, other cities, but this time it was under her jurisdiction. Her radio crackled. "Sergeant Clark, Captain wants a briefing at headquarters." She looked once more through the windshield at the glow of the hospital windows. "On my way," she said. At the precinct, the mood was electric. Reporters crowded the entrance. In the conference room, the chief of police stood surrounded by senior staff. Naomi entered, removing her cap. The chief's voice was low but cold. "Two officers, one unconscious man. Cameras everywhere. Fix this." Naomi replied calmly, "We cannot fix it, sir. We can face it." The chief looked at her, caught between anger and resignation. "You want transparency?" he asked. "Then you lead the internal review." She nodded once. "I already started." That night, as she drove home, the radio played a clip from a protest forming outside City Hall. Voices chanted in unison, "Justice for Elijah." She turned off the sound but not the feeling. In the dark, her reflection in the windshield looked older than her years, but steadier too. Tomorrow would not just be another day, it would be the start of reckoning. Morning came heavy with headlines. Every paper, every station carried the same image. Elijah Brooks in a hospital bed, his wrists bruised. A single caption reading, "Deaf man assaulted by police." Outside the precinct, a line of protesters stretched along the block, holding signs that read, "See us, stop the silence, and accountability now." The air smelled of rain and tension. Sergeant Naomi Clark stood by the window of her office watching the crowd. Her phone vibrated nonstop calls from reporters, messages from advocacy groups, even threats from strangers who believed the department had gone too far or not far enough. She ignored them all and focused on the file in her hands. Officer Carter Mills, 10 years of service, 6 complaints for unnecessary aggression, all dismissed. Officer Dana Holt, commendations for restraint, 0 complaints, but now her name was buried under the same scandal. Naomi closed the file and whispered to herself, "Patterns do not lie." In the hospital, Elijah was awake. His sister Lydia sat beside him, her hands resting over his. The room hummed with machines, but between them there was a stillness that words could not fill. Lydia signed slowly. "They cannot undo it, but they will answer." Elijah blinked and nodded faintly, his lips shaping a silent yes. A nurse entered softly, followed by a tall man in a gray suit carrying a leather folder. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "my name is Aaron Fields. I am a civil rights attorney. I was asked by the National Association for Deaf Citizens to represent your brother." Lydia's eyes filled with tears, part relief, part resolve. "We are not doing this for money," she said. "We are doing it so it does not happen again." Aaron nodded. "Then we are on the same side." Back at headquarters, Naomi gathered her team. "We have one job," she said, her voice steady. "Truth, not damage control." She assigned investigators to review every body cam, every dispatch call, every report filed that day. Within hours, discrepancies appeared. Carter's initial statement claimed Elijah reached into his pocket. The video showed both hands visible the entire time. The radio log showed Dana requesting medical backup before Carter even filed his incident report. The lies began to unravel. In the chief's office, Naomi laid the evidence on the table. "This is not procedural failure," she said. "This is cultural failure." The chief rubbed his temples, saying nothing. "If we bury this, we bury the department," Naomi continued. "But if we face it, we start over." He finally looked up. "You want to make this public?" "It already is," Naomi said. "The only question is whether we stand on the right side of it." Later that afternoon, as rain began to fall, Lydia held a press conference on the hospital steps. Dozens of cameras pointed at her, microphones close enough to catch every word. "My brother cannot hear your voices," she began, "but he can see your actions. He can see who stands for him." Her voice trembled only once before turning firm. "He worked caring for others, and he was treated like a threat. We are not asking for revenge. We are asking for humanity." The crowd erupted in applause. Watching from her cruiser, Naomi felt something shift, a storm breaking not just outside, but inside the city's conscience. She whispered, almost to herself, "This is where it begins." By the third day, the story had reached national news. Morning anchors repeated Elijah Brooks's name like a headline turned heartbeat. Cable panels debated policy, while talk radio hosts spun arguments that filled the air with more heat than truth. In the middle of it all, Naomi Clark sat in a conference room lined with glass, A laptop opened to the official footage. Every frame of the incident played back in silence. The sound was off, but the truth was loud. Behind her, Captain Reynolds entered quietly. "You have the entire department under a microscope," he said. "Internal Affairs wants to move fast, but the mayor is watching." Naomi replied without turning. "So is the country." She pressed pause on the footage, the image freezing on Carter's hand mid-strike. "If we get this wrong, every deaf or disabled person who ever steps outside alone will feel that hit again." The captain sighed, sitting across from her. "You cannot fix the world, Clark." Naomi looked up, eyes steady. "Maybe not, but I can stop pretending it is not broken." Across town, Lydia Brooks and attorney Aaron Fields met with a coalition of advocates in a community center filled with volunteers. Posters lined the walls with slogans about equality, justice, and reform. A local journalist live-streamed the meeting. Lydia stood in front of the crowd, her voice carrying both grief and determination. "We are not here to destroy," she said. "We are here to rebuild what trust should mean." Behind her, Aaron outlined legal steps, announcing the filing of a federal civil rights lawsuit. "This is not just about one officer," he said. "It is about systemic neglect. A man was assaulted for being different, and that cannot stand." The crowd nodded, some clapping, some crying quietly. Outside, thunder rolled again, as if the sky itself refused peace. Later that evening, Naomi drove to the hospital to visit Elijah. The hallways were dim, the fluorescent lights humming low. Lydia met her by the door, wary but calm. Naomi removed her cap. "I did not come as an officer," she said. "I came as someone who should have stopped this sooner." Lydia studied her face, then stepped aside. Elijah was awake, sitting upright, his hands moving slowly as he signed. Naomi watched, recognizing pieces of the language from her training years ago. She signed back, imperfect but clear. "I am sorry." Elijah blinked, then formed the sign for "thank you." For a moment, the room felt quiet in a sacred way, not from absence but from understanding. As Naomi left, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Internal Affairs. "Preliminary findings complete. Prepare for disciplinary hearing." The next morning, the hearing room was packed. Cameras lined the back wall, flashes waiting for a fall. Carter Mills sat at the center table, jaw clenched, uniform replaced by a plain suit. Dana Holt sat beside her attorney, pale but resolute. Naomi entered with a folder thick with evidence, and a weight heavier than her badge. The panel began reading charges: excessive force, misconduct, violation of civil rights. Carter interrupted, voice rising. "I followed procedure." Naomi's voice cut clean through the room. "Procedure does not justify blindness." The panel chair raised a hand for silence, but the moment had already turned. The audience could feel it. A line had been crossed, and there would be no return. Outside the precinct, chants began again. "Justice for Elijah. End the silence." The movement was no longer local, it was national. And as the first drops of rain fell against the courthouse steps, Naomi looked upward, whispering to herself, "Now they see." The disciplinary hearing stretched into its second hour, the air thick with quiet judgment. Every word spoken inside that room carried the weight of history. Naomi Clark sat near the front, her notes lined in meticulous handwriting. Across from her, Officer Carter Mills stared blankly at the table, sweat beading on his forehead. His attorney whispered strategies that sounded more like excuses than defense. The panel chair, an older woman named Judge Marianne Ellis, cleared her throat. "We have reviewed the footage, the statements, and the medical reports. What we see is not an isolated act, but a pattern of disregard." Carter shifted, his voice cracking under pressure. "I made a mistake, but I did not mean to hurt him," Naomi replied calmly. "Meaning does not erase impact, officer." Dana Holt raised her eyes from the table. "Sergeant Clark," she said softly, "I tried to stop him. I should have spoken louder." Naomi nodded once. "You did not cause this, but silence allows harm to grow roots." A murmur spread through the audience. Journalists scribbled notes while cameras flashed like distant lightning. Judge Ellis continued, "Officer Mills, you are hereby terminated effective immediately. Officer Holt, you are suspended without pay pending retraining and evaluation." The room fell still, the kind of silence that comes before applause. Lydia Brooks, seated in the back, closed her eyes, her hand over her heart. Outside the building, hundreds of protesters waited. When Naomi stepped through the double doors, microphones surged toward her like a tide. "Sergeant Clark, "Do you believe justice was served?" one reporter shouted. Naomi paused, looking at the sea of expectant faces. "Justice is not served," she said. "It is built. Today was the foundation." The crowd erupted in cheers. A few hours later, at City Hall, Mayor Thornton held an emergency press conference. He looked uneasy, standing beneath the city seal, sweat glistening under the lights. "Effective immediately," he announced, "the department will implement new disability awareness, protocols, bias training, and community oversight boards." Reporters fired questions faster than he could answer, but one cut through the noise. "Mayor, will Sergeant Clark lead the reform?" He hesitated, then said, "Yes, she will." That same night, Naomi sat alone at her kitchen table, the glow of her laptop reflecting off a stack of case files. The sound of rain tapped against the window. She clicked open a new folder labeled Reform Initiative. Inside, she began drafting the first proposal. Mandatory ASL training for all officers. Inclusion of deaf and disabled consultants in policy review. Accountability reports to be made public every quarter. Each line felt like reclaiming something that had been lost. Her phone buzzed again, a text from Lydia Brooks. It read, "Thank you for standing when others looked away." Naomi stared at it for a long moment before replying, "We are not done." Across the city, Elijah sat propped up in his hospital bed, the news on mute, captions scrolling across the screen. His eyes followed the words, "2 officers disciplined, new reform led by Clark." He reached for his notepad and wrote a single sentence in careful, uneven handwriting. "Maybe they are learning to listen." The camera that filmed him earlier had started the outrage, but now the quiet of his room told another story, one of survival, dignity, and the first flicker of change. Outside, thunder rolled again, not in anger but in renewal. The storm that once shattered peace now sounded like a heartbeat. And somewhere in that rhythm, justice began to take shape. 2 weeks later, the city moved at half speed, caught between outrage and reflection. Billboards that once advertised luxury cars now carried public service messages. "See every citizen, hear every voice." The phrase had been taken from Sergeant Naomi Clark's press statement and turned into a movement slogan overnight. Inside police headquarters, fluorescent lights buzzed softly as Naomi entered the training hall where 40 new recruits waited. The atmosphere was uncertain, half curiosity, half discomfort. On the screen behind her was a still frame from the incident the moment Carter Mills's hand froze mid-air. Naomi faced the room. "This is not a story to shame you," she began. "It is a reminder that every uniform you wear holds the power to protect or to destroy. You decide which one it will be." She clicked to the next slide, showing Elijah's ID badge from the assisted living center. "He was on his way home from caring for others," she said. "He was struck down because someone saw threat instead of humanity." Her voice did not rise, but the silence that followed was sharper than any reprimand. A hand went up near the back, a young trainee named Evan Lee. "Ma'am," he asked, "how do we stop seeing through fear?" Naomi looked at him for a long moment before replying. "By remembering that fear is not an instruction. Listening is." Across town, at the hospital, Elijah was learning to walk without crutches. Physical therapy had become routine, but his resilience was extraordinary. Lydia filmed short clips for advocacy networks, and one of those clips caught the attention of a national news program. Within days, an invitation arrived, a live interview for both Elijah and Lydia. They accepted, hesitant but resolute. When the broadcast aired, millions watched as Elijah, using sign language and an interpreter, spoke for the first time publicly. His message was simple: "I forgive, but I will not forget. I want change, not sympathy." The world listened. Social media flooded with support. Even officers from other states wrote messages of apology and solidarity. Meanwhile, Naomi's reform proposal reached the mayor's desk. The document was thicker than expected, filled with data, policy revisions, and testimonies. During a late-night call, Mayor Thornton admitted, "You are asking for more than training, Clark. You are asking to rebuild the system," Naomi replied. "Exactly. Bandages do not fix broken foundations." The following week, the city council convened to vote on her initiative. The chamber was packed. Citizens filled every seat, and hundreds stood outside in the rain holding candles. Naomi presented her plan step by step, each point backed with evidence. When she finished, the room stood silent until the council chair asked, "All in favor?" 11 hands rose. 1 abstained. The motion passed. Applause broke out, slow but unstoppable. Lydia and Elijah, watching from the gallery, embraced as tears rolled down her cheeks. Outside, the crowd erupted in chants of victory. Reporters surrounded Naomi as she exited the building, asking if this was the end of the fight. She shook her head and said, "This is the beginning of accountability." That night, as the city lights reflected off wet pavement, Elijah stood at his window, watching car headlights blur into silver streaks. For the first time in weeks, the soundless world around him did not feel isolating. It felt alive. Somewhere in the distance, thunder murmured again. But this time it sounded like applause. The city did not return to normal, it evolved. 3 months after the vote, the first Listening Initiative class launched inside the police academy, pairing new recruits with mentors from the deaf and disabled community. Cameras documented the sessions, not for publicity but for accountability. Naomi Clark stood quietly at the back of the room, watching as officers learned to communicate through gestures instead of command. For the first time, the sound of authority was replaced by the rhythm of understanding. She smiled slightly, the kind that came not from victory but from relief. Outside, the community center buzzed with energy. Lydia Brooks had become a leading advocate for accessible justice reform, her voice now recognized across the state. She organized outreach programs with schools and local businesses, teaching people how to interact respectfully with those who live in silence. Elijah joined her whenever he could, speaking through sign language and expression. His calm strength had made him a symbol of perseverance. That afternoon, they were invited to the reopening of the city's public safety headquarters. Mayor Thornton cut the ribbon, while reporters clicked photos of the new motto etched above the entrance, "Protect with vision, serve with empathy." Naomi approached Elijah and Lydia afterward. She signed slowly to him, "Congratulations, you changed this city." Elijah smiled and signed back, "We changed it together." Meanwhile, deep inside City Hall, resistance was brewing. Not everyone supported the reform. A few veteran officers claimed that Naomi's new policies weakened authority. Anonymous letters appeared online blaming political pressure for the department's shift. The controversy caught fire when a talk show host called the reform soft policing. Naomi did not respond publicly, but she knew the storm was coming. Late one night, while reviewing files in her office, she received an email marked confidential. It was from an internal investigator, someone she trusted. The message read, "We found something in the archived files. Officer Mills's complaints were suppressed by a former deputy chief. There may have been intentional cover-ups." Naomi stared at the screen, anger simmering beneath her calm. She forwarded the message to the mayor with a single note, "We are not finished." The next morning, she called a press conference. Cameras gathered in the rain as she stepped to the podium, her uniform immaculate, her voice steady. "Justice is not maintenance," she said. "It is motion, and motion means uncovering every truth, no matter how old or inconvenient." Reporters shouted questions, but she continued, "We are opening an independent investigation into all prior cases dismissed under biased review. This department will not protect wrongdoers, it will protect integrity." Across town, Elijah watched the broadcast on television, his expression unreadable but proud. Lydia stood beside him, whispering softly, "She is still fighting." He nodded, signing, "Always." That evening, Naomi returned to her office to find a letter slipped under her door. It was handwritten on plain paper. "Thank you for hearing us when others refused to listen." The community. She held it for a long moment before placing it on her desk. Outside, the night city glowed streetlights reflecting off puddles, headlights tracing paths like veins of light through a living organism. The sound of thunder rolled again in the distance, but this time it was not a warning, it was a reminder. Change had arrived, but the work of justice had just begun. 6 months later, the city felt different, quieter but more awake. The headlines had faded, but the reform Naomi Clark had started was still unfolding beneath the surface. Every precinct now had an accessibility liaison. Every academy recruit trained in empathy before enforcement. But with progress came pressure. Naomi's inbox overflowed with hate mail and threats, messages accusing her of betraying the badge. Yet for every threat, there were 10 letters of thanks from citizens who finally felt seen. One morning, as the sun climbed over the skyline, Naomi met with Mayor Thornton in his office overlooking the courthouse square. "You have made enemies," he said, pouring coffee into 2 cups. "That means the system is moving." Naomi smiled faintly. "Change never makes friends," she replied. The mayor leaned back. The federal review team arrives next week. They are impressed with your data. Complaints of bias have dropped by 38%. Naomi nodded. But it is not enough. 1 percentage point still means hundreds of lives. At that same hour, Lydia Brooks prepared for a keynote speech at the National Civil Rights Summit in Chicago. She wore a navy blazer and carried a folder filled with photos of Elijah's recovery journey. Before stepping on stage, she looked at him sitting in the front row, hands folded neatly, eyes filled with quiet pride. When she spoke, her voice carried through the hall with clarity and conviction. "My brother cannot hear your applause," she said, "but he can see your commitment. Justice is not an echo. It is an action. And every one of you has the power to choose it." The crowd rose in a standing ovation. The video of her speech went viral overnight, reigniting the conversation about policing and accessibility nationwide. Meanwhile, Naomi's investigation into the suppressed complaints reached its climax. Her team uncovered evidence of cover-ups stretching back a decade, cases dismissed, reports altered, victims ignored. She knew exposing it would cost her allies and perhaps her career, but she also knew silence was not an option. That evening, she called an emergency meeting with her internal affairs officers. "We bring this to the public," she said. "No redactions, no filters." One officer hesitated. "Sergeant, this could destroy what is left of the department's reputation." Naomi looked up. "Then let it. Reputation built on silence is rot." The next morning, the report was released online, 200 pages of names, dates, and suppressed evidence. Within hours, national outlets picked it up. The city's police commission called an emergency press conference to address the findings. Cameras flashed as Naomi stood behind the podium beside Mayor Thornton and federal investigators. She spoke plainly. "We cannot rewrite what happened," she said, "but we can refuse to hide it. The people deserve truth, even when it burns." The crowd erupted with applause. Outside, the steps of City Hall filled again with citizens holding candles. This time not in protest, but in solidarity. Across town, Elijah watched from his living room, the glow of the candles reflecting in his eyes. Lydia sat beside him, signing softly. "They heard us." He signed back, finally. Naomi, driving home through the city that had once been broken by silence, rolled down her window. The sound of distant cheers carried through the night air. It was not the noise of rebellion anymore, it was the rhythm of renewal, steady, real, and unstoppable. By the time the federal report was fully reviewed, the city had become a model for reform. Other departments began calling for guidance, and national conferences invited Naomi Clark to speak about accountability and trust. She accepted only one of those invitations, a live televised forum in Washington, D.C., where victims, activists, and law enforcement leaders gathered in the same room for the first time. As the cameras rolled, Naomi stood at the center of the stage beneath bright white lights. She did not read from notes. Her voice carried steady and deliberate. "Justice," she said, "is not a statement we make when cameras are on. It is a practice that must survive when no one is watching." The audience fell silent. "We all wear symbols," she continued. "Badges, uniforms, titles. But symbols mean nothing without integrity. If we want to rebuild trust, we start by removing fear from our own reflection." When she finished, the room erupted in applause, and the clip spread across the internet overnight. Back home, Lydia watched the broadcast on her laptop, Elijah beside her. He smiled as he signed. "She is changing them from inside." Lydia nodded, her eyes glistening. "She is changing all of us." A week later, Naomi returned to her office to find the mayor waiting. "You have been offered a position with the Federal Task Force on Equity," he said. "It is national oversight work. They want you to lead it." Naomi looked down at the letter in her hands, the seal of the Department of Justice printed at the top. She had spent months cleaning the city she loved, but part of her knew the fight was larger than one jurisdiction. "If I leave," she said quietly, "will the reforms stay?" The mayor smiled. "They are no longer yours. They belong to the people now." That night, Naomi visited Elijah and Lydia one last time before her departure. The small living room was filled with soft lamplight and framed photos of family. Elijah handed her a folded piece of paper. It was a drawing of an ear surrounded by radiating lines, a symbol of listening. Below it, he had written in uneven letters, "For those who hear with their hearts." Naomi's voice broke slightly as she said, "I will carry this with me." He signed back, "Carry the truth, too." The next morning, Naomi packed her badge, her files, and the note into a single leather folder. As her flight lifted off the runway, the skyline of her city glimmered below like a promise kept. Meanwhile, at a community event downtown, Lydia stood before a crowd of students, her brother by her side. "My brother's story was never about pain," she said into the microphone. "It was about proof. Proof that silence can be broken, that empathy is louder than hate." The audience applauded, their faces illuminated by the light of a new mural unveiled behind them. It showed Elijah signing the word justice, his hands glowing in golden paint. Underneath were the words, "We all have a voice. Use it." As dusk settled, Naomi's plane disappeared into the horizon, carrying her toward the next battle for fairness. But below, in the city she had transformed, the work continued without her. For the first time in a long while, the streets were calm, not because the world was perfect, but because people had finally started listening to one another. 6 months later, the nation had changed its tone. What began as a single incident on a quiet suburban street had become a blueprint for reform across the country. Sergeant Naomi Clark, now Director Clark of the Federal Task Force on Equity, stood before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C. Cameras pointed toward her, and microphones waited for her every word. Her Navy suit was crisp, her badge replaced with a lapel pin shaped like an open ear, a symbol designed by Elijah Brooks himself. Behind her sat community advocates, officers, and civil rights leaders. She adjusted the microphone and began. "We are not here to rewrite the law," she said. "We are here to rewrite the culture that enforces it." Members of Congress leaned in as she continued. "The reform we began in one city proved that accountability is not anti-police, it is pro-humanity. We saw use of force complaints drop by nearly 40%, but more importantly, we saw trust return where fear once lived." A congressman interrupted. "Director Clark, are you suggesting this model can be scaled nationally?" Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "Not suggesting," she said. "Proving." The room filled with quiet agreement. Meanwhile, back in her home city, Lydia Brooks was preparing for a commemorative ceremony. The mayor had renamed the community park after her brother, the Elijah Brooks Listening Garden. The park's entrance featured a bronze sculpture of 2 hands mid-sign, forming the word respect. Children played nearby, their laughter echoing through the open space. Lydia stood beside the monument with tears in her eyes. "He never wanted fame," she whispered to a local reporter. "He just wanted to live in a world that did not mistake his silence for defiance." The camera panned to Elijah, now walking without assistance, greeting attendees with a calm smile. His hands moved gracefully as he signed to the crowd. "Thank you for hearing us." His interpreter repeated the words aloud, and applause rippled through the air like wind through leaves. Across the country, the story of Elijah Brooks and Naomi Clark had become part of training materials for new law enforcement recruits. Videos of Lydia's speeches were shown in classrooms, inspiring young students to pursue law, policy, and community leadership. That evening, Naomi watched a live broadcast of the park's dedication from her D.C. apartment. The sight of Elijah standing beneath the golden light of sunset filled her with a quiet sense of closure. Her phone buzzed a message from Lydia. It read, "You kept your promise." Naomi smiled faintly and replied, "So did you." Later that night, she walked to her balcony overlooking the Capitol. The city glowed below, a sea of lights pulsing like the heartbeat of a nation still learning to listen. She thought of the first day, the flashing lights, the confusion, the silence, and how far they had all come since then. Justice had not come easily, but it had come honestly. And that, she thought, was how change truly began. Not in shouts, but in steady, relentless listening. As she turned to go inside, thunder rolled softly in the distance, not as a threat, but as remembrance. The sky, it seemed, had not forgotten the sound of awakening. 1 year later, the story that began with pain had become a lesson carried in classrooms, courtrooms, and precincts across the country. The federal task force Naomi Clark led had expanded into a permanent division, the National Office for Ethical Policing. Its mission statement was engraved on the marble wall behind her desk. Justice listens. That morning, she stood by the window overlooking Washington, D.C., the city alive beneath a calm sky. Her assistant entered, handing her a folder. "Director Clark, the president would like you to attend the national ceremony tonight. They will be honoring the Brooks family." Naomi paused, letting the words settle. "Tell them I would not miss it." Across the city, Lydia Brooks helped her brother Elijah adjust the lapel pin on his suit jacket. It was the same design he had once drawn by hand, the ear with radiating lines, now recognized as the emblem of the Listening Initiative. Cameras flashed as they stepped onto the stage of the Lincoln Memorial that evening, where thousands had gathered for the first National Day of Equity. Naomi joined them, standing between Lydia and Elijah as the lights dimmed and a hush swept through the crowd. The announcer's voice echoed over the reflecting pool. Tonight, we honor those who turned tragedy into transformation. Sergeant Naomi Clark, Lydia Brooks, and Elijah Brooks, symbols of courage, empathy, and reform. Applause rose like a wave. Naomi took a breath, then spoke into the microphone. A year ago, this nation watched a man be misunderstood for what he could not do. Today, we celebrate what we all can do: listen, learn, and change. She turned slightly toward Elijah. He taught us that silence is not absence. It is a language waiting to be heard. Elijah smiled and lifted his hands, signing words that the interpreter translated aloud. The world finally heard me. The crowd erupted, some clapping, some crying, as the monument lights illuminated their faces. When the ceremony ended, Naomi and Lydia stood together, watching people linger by the water. "Do you think it will last?" Lydia asked quietly. Naomi's gaze stayed on the reflection of the memorial in the pool. "Change does not vanish," she said. "It echoes. Every person here will carry it somewhere new." The following morning, newspapers across the country printed the same photograph: Naomi, Lydia, and Elijah standing hand in hand under the inscription carved in stone. "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." The image became a symbol of the modern civil rights movement. Weeks later, Naomi received a letter from a small-town police recruit who wrote, "Because of your work, my first words in uniform were not a command. They were an apology." She folded the note carefully and placed it beside Elijah's drawing on her desk. That night, as she left the office, the streets outside were quiet. She paused at the steps, listening not to the noise of sirens or traffic, but to the hum of a city learning to move with empathy. In the distance, thunder rolled again, soft and steady, like applause from the sky. It reminded her how it all began with a single moment of misunderstanding that grew into a movement of humanity. And as she walked toward the light of the Capitol, Naomi whispered to herself, "This is what listening sounds like."